All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Charlie's World.
Yeah.
Wow.
And a Cultish True Crime exclusive, or our first Cultish True Crime. Andrew, Super Sleuth Andrew, Super Sleuth of the show.
Yeah. Investigator today.
Right.
You are the you are the forensic investigator detective, and so we are excited to dig into this. We are here with someone who's one of my dear good friends. We've known each other for such a long time. You are a member of Apologia Church. You are newly married.
right.
You are a mom now and a mom to be. So we're very happy for that.
Oh, well, thank you.
I am so happy to have you on. We've been waiting for this for so long. So you just tell everyone just a little bit about yourself. So you're a huge true crime fan.
Right. My name is Dr. Robyn Hall. I'm a doctor of clinical psychology here in Phoenix.
Yes.
And Jerry is right. This is, we've been friends for a lot of years, and I'm so excited to do this because it combines my three favorite things, true crime, psychology, and Jesus. So
Yes.
I think it's going to be a really neat episode or episodes. And I'm really excited to get started. So a little bit about me. I said I'm kind of a true crime nut, follow all of the major true crime podcasts, probably more than I should even, and consider myself, an armchair detective at that. But I have a very extensive background and expertise in trauma, which is extremely fitting for looking at Charles Manson and his family, quote unquote. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from this as Christians. I'm really about how it speaks to total depravity and our need for Jesus. So I think it's going to be really fun.
And especially right now, I mean, things are so uncertain in the world, and there was, even in Manson's time, his upbringing and everything leading up to 1969, there was so much craziness and uncertainty in the world, and that set a precedent to create a movement like that.
Right.
And now we're saying, with all the craziness going on, when we start laying out everything, people see there's an opportunity for history in many ways to repeat itself.
Right.
And I think what's really good is that Manson has really been explored by multiple different angles. There's multiple different books. I read a couple of different books leading up to this. Obviously, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, fantastic film. Really enjoyed it, and you have Quentin Tarantino's take on it, and you really have a public that's just fascinated by it. Just the name Charles Manson, 50 years later.
Right.
Every generation is kind of that impact name, kind of like Jim Jones.
Make you shiver.
Yes.
Right. Everybody immediately conjures this picture, right? And,
Right.
in my mind's eye, I can see that crazy, detached, really insane, depraved look, that famous picture of him, coming into the courtroom. I think, too, what you were saying, Jerry, there's really a lot of parallels if we look at the culture of what's happening right now and the culture of the late 1960s, which is when these crimes took place. Lots of race issues were happening then. There was a lot of, rebellion in the hippie movement, even a lot of stuff on the forefront, civil unrest. And I think that, the parallels between what was happening in that time frame and what's currently happening are just, it really this couldn't be at a better time.
Andrew and I were just talking about this.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to dealing with Manson, I think that we've always wanted any sort of topic. We always want it. We don't just sort of want to regurgitate what everyone else has said. We want to try to the best of our ability to give an approach that's unique and fresh. I think one obviously is to really deal with cult. This is an example of why you need to deal with cults from a Christian perspective, because there are a lot of true crime podcasts, or even a lot of really well written, historically documented books. The one I believe it's just called Manson is the book that I read. Really excellent historical account, but they deal in the same way. It's the same guy who wrote The Road to Jonestown. So the same author, they kind of really deal with the sociological environments and the historical aspects of what made this group of women, made Charlie come to rise. And then you have the psychological aspect, which we're going to get into, about the reality is that relationships with family of origin and also the sociological environment and how you're treated does have a huge impact on you. But I think one of the things that is very important when you're looking with someone like Charlie is that if you don't approach it from a approach it from a point of neutrality, and you don't really look at it as from a Christian worldview, and look at someone of Manson who was someone who was made in the image of God,
right?
And what made him tick. There's things that the Bible kind of gives some ideas of how to look inside the mind of Manson. Mm-hmm. He knew God. He suppressed the truth and unrighteousness, and he worshipped the creature rather than the creator. So you look at all those things. So all that being said, what we want to do, and just to kind of give you a heads up, this is a true crime series. This is a sinful world. What we're going to be discussing in many levels is going to be disturbing. So I just want to advise you that if you have children around, and if you are, perhaps you just are a sensitive person, you just want to listen with discretion, and this may not be. You might want to tune in once we're done with the series. This might not be for you. Yeah, and so just to advise you, if you have children around, or perhaps you are a sensitive person yourself, we are going to be dealing with some mature content regarding. We're talking about true crime. We're talking about murders that took place that were graphic. We kind of gave you a hint at the very beginning of that when we talked about, which is one of the most infamous murders that just horrified people and really put a whole city in paralysis, really on lockdown of all things, given current circumstances. Just, again, be sensitive to that. So let's start at a lot of times, a lot of other Manson podcasts, they start they kind of build up to the murder. We're going to talk about it now so people can understand this. This is when the world was really introduced to Manson. No one really knew him except for his followers, and we're going to expand who his followers were. We might touch on them a little bit. We're going to expand that more into our series. So let's talk about this. What took place here? This was August 1969,
right? And
we talked about Abigail Folger knocks on the door, and what came after that, what detectives found on the next morning after the calls, and what they witnessed, it's still something that, if you look up, it still horrifies people, and that has captured people. That really...
Right. You can actually find the police reports online. They're very easily accessible. All of the photographs of the crime scene are also accessible. So for anyone that's really curious about what it actually looked like, you're at liberty to take a look at those photos, warning again that they're quite graphic. But the murders that took place over, late in the evening, August 8th, and then early in the morning of August 9th, 1969, they were brutal. I mean, there really isn't a better word. They were heinous and brutal. And they actually weren't the first murders committed by Charles Manson and the family.
No.
The first murder that we really know about was actually the murder of Gary Hinman, which is kind of projected to have occurred sometime in July of that year. So, Andrew, do you want to talk about what the police report says?
Yeah, so I have the police report pulled up, and we went ahead and looked at it. And this is the original police report filed. And it was... Some of the investigators at the scene were Lieutenant R.C. Madlock, who was the commander. Then we have Lieutenant J.J. Grigori, Sergeant F. Gravanti, Sergeant T.L. Rogers. And this is part of the police report. I'm going to go ahead and start reading it, and then we'll go into the descriptions of the bodies as well and how everyone was found. So, sometime after midnight, August 9th, 1969, an unknown suspect or suspects entered the Cielo property via the front gate, which is operated by an electric push button that can be operated from the outside of the gate. From this point, there are three possible theories which have been reached after analyzing physical evidence. So they came up with three different theories. A couple of them I think are kind of irrelevant to after what was discovered later. So I'm just going to go ahead and just read the main theory here. So the first theory is that the killers climbed a telephone pole located just north of the above described electronic button, which opens the gate to the Cielo property. The phone wire at the top of this pole had been cut in such a manner that it stopped phone service to the Cielo property. However, it did not allow the phone wire that runs from the pole to the house to fall to the ground. The killers also cut a small piece of 2-strand wire which runs from the Cielo home to the telephone pole near the top and then down to where the bottom, or where the button for the gate is located. So we can see that they had been thinking about this, right? They cut phone wires. This is not just something where it's plainly just a heat of passion crime or things. They had thinking and motive.
And also what people realize too, as we lead into this, there is a connection to this property that has to do, there's a special Charles had a special connection to this property way prior to this murder, so there wasn't just a random locale.
Right.
There's purpose and intent behind it, but go ahead with what you're saying.
So at one time the wire was connected to 2 speakers which were used for communications between the house and the gate opener. This had not been in use since the Polanskis leased the property in February of 1969. This wire was cut and had fallen across the ground in a north-south direction across Cielo Drive. The killers then entered the gate at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning and were observed by the first victim, Stephen Parent. This is what they believed at the time. And he was leaving the guest house, which was occupied by a houseboy, William Garrettson. The killers had been hired to kill Sharon Polanski, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Wachowski, and Abigail Folger. Parent was shot 3 times as he attempted to drive his vehicle from the Cielo property. The killers continued to the main house, the Polanski residence, where they proceeded to kill the 4 intended victims.
Right.
So that was the most popular theory that there was.
Right. And just to mention too, you mentioned Sharon Polanski. I believe that a lot of times in Hollywood, an actress will keep their last name that's famous with what they're kind of
brand.
Their brand.
Right.
And so the reason why I say that is that she was married to Roman Polanski. And at this time, if anyone who's followed the story of Manson would know that at that time, Roman Polanski was a very popular filmmaker. He made very popular movies like Rosemary's Baby, a lot of other films. And so he was overseas on a project. And so he was away from the house. Sharon Tate was 8 months pregnant at this time, expecting their first child.
Yep.
So Stephen Parent, who was 18 years old, was really a victim of circumstance. He was, the secular world would say that he was really at the wrong place in the wrong time. As Reformed believers, we understand that there really is no coincidence. But he was walking to his car from a friend's house, a friend who was staying, Garrettson? Yeah,
William Garrettson.
William Garrettson, who was staying in the guest house on the Cielo property, and he was just going home. He was going to get into his car and drive away, and really had no warning whatsoever, and is shot to death with the .22 caliber that they believe or speculate that Tex Watson was carrying with him that night. So he, was an unexpected obstacle that showed up, and they took care of it by shooting him.
Yep, that's right. We can go into the description too of how they found him.
Yeah, and so when they found him, and I don't want to go into too really graphic descriptions. I want to give people just the general idea of what took place. Is that these were not painless murders. These were not quick murders. These people, they came in with knives. Charlie had spent extensive time really conditioning. We'll go in this as we expand to all of them were stabbed repeatedly, including Sharon Tate when she was 8 months pregnant, begged for her life, begged them to allow her to have the baby, then kill her, was anything. And at that time they said no, and that was one of the most shocking aspects, and that's what sent really LA into a complete panic. You'd even say lockdown. Yeah. So with all that being said, what we want to do is, like I said, this is a murder that shocked everyone. We want to start at the very beginning. How did this really start? Because we're looking at cults from a psychological aspect, a sociological aspect. We're going to even deal really with a theological aspect. We want to deal with this holistically. So historically, we're going to start at the very beginning. And so, Rob, we're going to kind of with all your research on Manson, we want to kind of understand, what was his psyche like growing up as a child? What was that like? So he was born on November 12th, 1934. Right. Charlie was born in Cincinnati. He was the illegitimate son of a 16-year-old named Kathleen Maddox. And so sometimes you'll have a relationship where it's really a single mom household. And but at least that's somewhat of a stable environment. It's a stable single mom who just happens to be in those circumstances.
Sure.
That was not stable. So why don't you just go ahead and just introduce everyone to the very beginning of describe everyone what was Charlie's childhood like. Describe what you know about his mother and also his father, because there's a lot of issues as far as abandonment goes, a lot of childhood trauma that would have really affected him, really kind of leading up throughout his upbringing.
Right. So we kind of see this theme all the time in psychology and true crime, and it makes a lot of sense. But this idea of we inherit the sins of our fathers, which as Christians we know is true. We all inherited Adam's sin. So for us to expect for that to be any different when we're looking at anything psychological would be silly. But like you said, Jerry, his mom grew up and was working during the Depression as a prostitute. She was 16 years old when she gave birth to Charlie, and she didn't want anything to do with him, which I think, I don't want to generalize here, but I imagine that a lot of single 16-year-old mothers who are working in the line of work that she did would probably feel very much burdened by being pregnant and having a baby.
Right.
Just to kind of set the stage for that, she didn't name Charlie. On the birth certificate, no name Maddox is what was listed. So when you look at things like abandonment trauma and what that does to an individual, Charlie was not wanted here. He didn't have a place in the world right from the beginning. And I think that really cultivated this need to learn how to adapt and navigate in a culture where he didn't have any lifeline whatsoever. As far as when we look at things like sociopathy and psychopathy, which we'll get a little bit more into as we talk about, what actually happened in the cult of the family, the brainwashing, and so forth that took place between Charlie as the brainwasher and then the family members as the brainwashees. There are a few psychological explanations for why somebody would develop something like psychopathy or sociopathy. So, I'm going to I'll give you a brief overview of the clinical history there. So
we are in the doctor's office.
That's right. So there is a Canadian forensic psychologist by the name of Dr. Robert Hare. And he is kind of the father of forensic psychiatry, psychology. He spent his entire career investigating psychopathy and sociopathy in both the criminal and then civilian sectors. So very interesting. He's written several books. Two of my favorites, I'm sure we can include in show notes or whatever if people are interested in it. But just to kind of give everybody, a basic understanding, when somebody in psychology or a clinician in mental health uses terms like sociopath or psychopath, this is what we're saying. Those aren't diagnoses. Okay, so I can't diagnose somebody that comes into my office, you're a psychopath. That isn't a clinical diagnosis. What we're doing is we're describing traits, behaviors, personality structure. Okay, so when a psychologist talks about psychopathy, we're usually referring to a set of personality disorders, okay? So you guys will be familiar with narcissism, right? So narcissistic personality disorder is probably at the top of the pyramid when we're talking about, psychopathy. There are other personality disorders that fall into this category. So antisocial personality disorder, and then two others within this cluster, histrionic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. So we group disorders together based on their shared common features, right? Humans like to categorize and name things. Go figure, right?
Yeah, fake dominion.
Exactly. So, and naming things gives us a way of understanding them.
Yeah.
So,
and speaking of names, one of the things too is that you're dealing with from a clinical standpoint, but just we're in a culture right now where of impact words. So just psychopath and narcissist.
Yeah.
That's immediately like, oh, it's kind of, or you call it gaslighting, and like these popular psychologist buzzword, and so that obviously comes there. And so, but what you're doing though is you're taking these aspects. So people will look at someone like Charlie and say narcissist, psychopath.
Right.
What we're doing here is we're kind of almost sort of on a document. You click on one tab and 3 tabs open up.
Right.
We're describing from a clinical standpoint what that actually looks like as far as how you when you practice or when you treat someone.
Right.
And then how would this apply then, looking at, this is not someone who's sat down across the table from you.
Sure.
But it is someone who is and also I find it fascinating too, on his birth certificate has no name.
Right.
And now Charles Manson.
Right.
That is the name 50 years later.
This buzz name, right. It's a household name. We all know it. That's exactly right. Categorizing gives us a paradigm to understand behavior. We can really break all of it down very simply as Christians into a sin nature and, common grace, that God, restrains people from fully coming to realize the depths of their depravity. And then you get a case like Charles Manson, where that isn't restrained at all, and you see what happens. So when we talk about a psychopath, again, we're really referring to that grouping of personality disorders. We look at a few common traits. So the one at the top of the list is lack of empathy. So if I look at another human being as nothing more than an object, if I objectify them and make them worth no more than a table, that makes me the most dangerous person in the world, because I can do whatever I want to you. Right? I mean, if you have no value as a human, I can destroy you without thinking or blinking.
Right.
And we really see that happening here in this case. And again, to pull it out of our secular psychology back into a Christian worldview, we understand that. We don't really need a fancy explanation, in terms of this is where Charlie came from. These are all the trials and tribulations of his upbringing. We know that we're born sinful, and we know that, it's really only the grace of God that restrains that from fully manifesting, and in each person when it doesn't. But when we're comparing like the secular psychology points, so when we're trying to explain in a worldview outside of a Christian worldview what happened to Charlie or why he became the way that he is, I mean, he entered the world unwanted. He had no name. The abandonment trauma of not being wanted by your parents, means that you're alone in the world, right? I have no one to look after me, essentially. And I don't mean like he didn't have somebody to feed him. He didn't have somebody to put clothes on his back. He had no emotional intimacy or safety in the way that most of us do with, one parent or two parents. So I think it's really interesting, and it's important too that we note he was already incarcerated by the time he was 14 years old. He learned to survive being bullied by lying. He was a smaller guy. Had always been a smaller guy. And I read several books prepping for this episode too, and I can't remember which one I read this in. But he was very, very smart. He was very adaptive, and he learned that if he could deflect attention away from himself and by lying, then he wasn't beaten as badly by the bigger boys that were around him.
Conditions himself almost.
Right, exactly. I mean, so if you look at how would somebody develop this lack of empathy, right? There's a couple of different theories, and going back to Robert Hare's, I just really love his approach to this. What circumstances would make it adaptive for you to not have empathy? And you look at extreme trauma. I to break away into another true crime case, I think of Kuklinski, the Iceman killer from New York. He was a mafia hitman for hire.
Right.
And there's actually, you can see an interview between him and Hare on YouTube for free, it's really fascinating. But he describes this instance watching when he was like 4 or 5 years old of his father forcing his mother onto the roof of their home with a firearm and getting her to play chicken with the roof, like, jump off. So those are the types of circumstances where it becomes adaptive and healthy to lose empathy. If I don't care about what's going on here, then it doesn't hurt me.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're in a circumstance where you're constantly being traumatized, where what's happening around you is painful to a degree that it makes sense for you to not feel it, what starts as a coping mechanism becomes reflexive and intrinsic, and before you know it, it's a rigid, ingrained personality structure, and where empathy once was, it no longer is. So
it makes sense too, because Manson, in an interview talking about his mother, where he was reading all of these books by the time he was in jail, and they were talking about his mother being a prostitute and this or that. Well, Manson said in an interview, he said, well, no, it's not that she was like a prostitute. It's more that she was just ahead of her time.
Right.
She was a girl of the 60s pretty much before it ever happened. So in order to try to justify how his mother treated him, he had to redefine what it even is, essentially, to be kind of like a woman.
Right, that's right. Time. He rationalized it.
Yeah.
And I think too that really feeds into a lot of what Charlie's own like dogma was, what he was telling himself, and I think ultimately what he really came to believe, just kind of the insane ideas, spiritual ideas that we'll get into in a lot more detail later on. But I think the key point here is that it became very adaptive for Charlie at a really young age to stop caring about people. Not caring means that being abandoned by your mother and father doesn't hurt. Not caring means that if you don't have relationships with people, that doesn't matter. Not caring means that if you're rejected by this or that, and we'll get a lot more into his kind of delusional fixation with the Beatles and, this idea that he was going to be as, a star, in that same caliber. It's a way of protecting yourself from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune,
Yeah, and also when he went to the boarding school, which is the Gabalt School for Boys, and that was right away they realized that all the teachers and faculty, they realized this is a problem child, and they had lots of issues with them. To tell us about whether the things that you've like, if you saw from everything that you read. Because again, if you listen to tons of different podcasts, you'll find more of the details as far as the historical specifics of the way he acted out. We talked about him using kind of lying as a defense mechanism. Sure. But if just say that you were like the school psychologist, and all of a sudden we've got this new person that's born in school, Charlie, he's out of control. What would you, from there, like how would you, at this point, so we're talking about just kind of giving people an introduction of the fact that he'd had abandonment trauma from mother and father, and now we're dealing with him when he's now 13 years old. So now you have adolescents sort of growing into now teens. Right, like the normal ups and downs of puberty. Like, oh my goodness, I don't know how any of us really make it out alive, parents or teenagers. So if I imagine myself, in that position, seeing a young Charlie, and watching his charm and his glibness and his ability to kind of chameleon to whatever circumstances he's in to save himself. It's, it's a save yourself mentality. It's a survival mentality, right? I think what's really scary about Charlie is his ability to fit in, his ability to fly under the radar in that way.
I mean, it really is the mark of a true narcissist to be able to manipulate not just the people around you, but the environment around you to your benefit to get out of trouble. And clearly, like I said, he was already incarcerated in a youth detention facility at the age of 14. So he wasn't super great at staying out of trouble, but it was what he did within the context of where he was that would have been very, very alarming and fascinating, truly fascinating. His ability to befriend people in authority positions and to manipulate them. My guess is that if you talked to anybody that was outside of what would become the family later on, especially individuals that really didn't have any training or understanding of this kind of behavior, they would have described Charlie as a really nice but wayward youth that really just kind of had a bad start in life, and if he had some extra help or whatever, that he could be straightened out as time went on.
And eventually he ran away. From the boarding school. So this is another aspect, and maybe we'll kind of go along here, because now 13, 14 years old. So one of the times when you kind of look at different characteristics of people, you have those people, sometimes you call them people that are addicted to drama, addicted to chaos, where it's sort of like they're just sort of creating this environment around, or they're almost not trying to sound new agey, but it's like they're literally manifesting these situations. But literally you'll see that. So there's one thing is sometimes you'll have people almost like they're clueless of the chaos that they're creating, and they don't why do the problems always follow with them? They blame either the circumstance, wherever you go, there you are. It seems to me, though, that as you see Charlie and his progressions, he wasn't unaware of what he was doing. He was fully aware, and you saw that at a very young age, and you saw that a lot of times with the behavior, even at that boarding school, of using lying again as a manipulative tactic. So his first known crime was this is his introduction to the life of crime, 14 years old. It was an Indianapolis grocery store, and I have it here. There was a robbery where he was trying to find something to eat, but it says Charlie, he found a cash register change in a cigar box hidden under the counter. It was just over $100. Back then, it was probably a little more money. More money than he had ever seen in his life. The first thing that Charlie did was to rent a room on Indianapolis Skid Row and to eat as much as he possibly could handle. 14-year-old Charlie actually tried to go straight a while by getting a job delivering messages for Western Union, but he quickly began to supplement his wages by petty theft. This is 14 years old. So you're just beginning to see those traits go forward.
I mean, it's fascinating. So if you look at what he's learning from his parents, his mother, nothing is off limits. You do whatever you have to do to survive, including selling your own body. So taking advantage of people isn't really even it isn't a concept in his mind in the way that it is in my mind or your mind, because he doesn't view people the same way. The other person is objectified so that he can do whatever he wants to them. And like you said, Jerry, you really see the very beginning mustard seeds of that kind of manifesting here, at 14 years old, when he rips off this cash register, right? Challenging authority, having no respect for authority. The law doesn't apply to me. I'm above the law. You see these characteristics that will come out full force in Charlie later. You just see them start bubbling up over the surface here.
And one of the things you'll see too is that the relationship with his mother, that not only was she not present, she was absent, but she also was in a lot of legal trouble herself. So you talk about it was 1939. Catholic Maddox and her brother Luther, they were arrested. They tried to rob a gas station using a broken ketchup bottle. You might want to have a little more tact than that. You might really think that out further. And so then she ends up going to prison, and that's when he was sent to live with his aunt and uncle. So again, and what you're seeing though is that now you're seeing you're sort of being bounced around from household to household, not any sort of particular stable environment. So that's a sociological aspect, but then also jumping back to understanding from a Christian perspective that Charlie again is someone who's made in the image of God. and we are created for relationship.
Right.
That because we have a God who is Trinity, the God in his own nature, he's relational between the Father. The Father loves the Son, and you look all through the Gospel of John, it talks about that. So now he has this yearning. That's because that's just how he's wired.
Right.
But now all these environments and really a broken and sinful world has so convoluted his ideas of wanting to be important, wanting to be wanted.
Right. And what a healthy relationship actually even is, right? So, and even going back to that crime, there's a couple of different ways that a psychologist would look at, so you could see somebody robbing a gas station with a broken ketchup bottle as an act of desperation, right? I don't have any other weapon. I'm going to break this ketchup bottle and attempt to rob the store. But to me, knowing what we know about Charlie's mom and really about Charlie, my guess is that it's much more exemplary of grandiosity. I don't need anything more than a ketchup bottle to rob this store. I'm untouchable in that way. And clearly she wasn't, but in her mind, that my guess is that didn't even really occur to her at the time.
Yeah, she's still pretty young at that time too.
Yeah,
impulsive.
So, really, and I think so. His environment now being someone who's a sinner and wanting to find meaning and significance, trying to be sort of part of bigger than himself. I think the only way he could really find that was really through sort of, again, taking advantage, abusing other people. So you have that. And then, but it always seems to be this life of crime. This is what became his identity, to do these sorts of things, whether it's petty theft or other things that we'll get into. I was going to mention something real quickly, but go ahead.
Yeah, so like biblically, I think that God institutes the family for a reason, right? The first government instituted in the Bible is the institute of the family. And there's a reason for it, because God shows us how to have relationships if our family's in right relationship with God, number one. With Charlie, we can see the struggle, right? He doesn't have the law of God that he is pointed back to by his family. Instead, he's abandoned.
Right.
And what does he become? He becomes one who's at constant battle with a standard of the world, with his own standard, as thinking he is essentially an autonomous being, right? And in that, he becomes the type of person to where every other person in relationship around him becomes a means to an end.
Right.
Right. Not necessarily someone that he wants to get to know intimately or care about, but someone that he could actually use to get further to where he wants to go to advance his agenda.
An object. So he learns immediately that relationships are painful. They're not this loving, nurturing thing. They are painful. So if I disconnect myself from the emotional intimacy that most people have in relationships, I start looking at them, like just what you said, Andrew, as a means to an end, like a means to an end.
Yeah.
Right. So then I start objectifying everyone around me. How can this person get me what I need? And it really, like his relationship with his mom and really all of the caregivers in his life as a young man really gave this just distorted blueprint about what a relationship was. Yeah. And if you think about where we learn what relationships are, it's from our parents, right? It's from the people that raise us. So what he learned, that parents don't love you, that you're not worth anything, right? So that's what he takes with him into the world, right? Rather than, like what you were saying, having this structure with a head of the family that's leading the family back to Scripture, that can explain God's law and that desire for relationships that we all have inherently within a healthy context. He's left to make sense of it on his own, and he does what we all do without God. He eventually creates an idol, which is himself, right? He makes himself God in his own mind, and then he plays to that.
Yep.
And that gives him even more license to do whatever he wants to people.
Exactly.
Yeah, and one of the things you notice too is that, and this is important too when you look at the progression of where Manson is headed, and we're kind of starting at the beginning, kind of dealing with what a lot of other podcasts have done, talking about historical significant aspects of how Charlie went from this incredibly dysfunctional childhood all the way up until this crime that still 50 years later just really haunts the minds of people, of anyone who looks into it. And so when it comes to understanding from a Christian worldview, we have to just really look at the depravity of sin. one of the aspects of sin is that sin always takes you further than you could ever imagine. It's, someone, when you look at someone, whatever it is, whatever is going on in the news, it usually didn't start that way. Like one of my old pastors would say that when you hear about some guy who is in football, he's like a star football player, and and all of a sudden you find out he's doing cocaine and he was with prostitutes, and say he's part of some sort of sex trafficking ring. And I'm not naming any specific person, I'm just giving an example. But what you'll find out is it's not just all of a sudden this person like, oh, I've got this $1 million contract, let me go ahead and just start all these things. It starts off with one little compromise, but the one thing about with sin is that it never satisfies. You always sort of have to up the ante. And so probably I think some of the reasons why he did it too is I think there might have been an aspect too where he wanted to just have the thrill of taking advantage and dominating these people and controlling them. So I think there's an aspect of him wanting to do that too, but as you see this progresses, you'll see that continue to escalate.
Right.
So I want to give you all an example, and again, just advise you if you have children around, or if you have sensitive ears, what I'm going to talk about is disturbing, but again, we're talking about someone who was a criminal who did criminal things. This is a world that's fallen in sin. This world is rated R, as N.D. Wilson says. So 1952, this was kind of known as really his last act of real criminal violence. There was other petty theft and things like that we'll get into. But this was in a point in time. He was transferred to a reformatory, and in January 1952, holding a razor blade to a boy's throat, he sodomized him. He did that.
Yeah. And
then, basically because of that, he ended up being I won't get any more. There's other books that go more detail on that. We're not going to do that, but just that's something that he did. So you went from petty to theft. The thrill of $100, and buying yourself all this food. Who knows what the food was? It might have been all the great sweets, whatever. I don't know what Charlie saw as delicacies, to holding a razor blade to someone's throat and sodomizing them. That's a bit of an escalation, to say the least.
Right.
So you have that. So you'll see continue, and then what you'll see, though, you talk about him being manipulative. So that happened in January 1952. In August 1952, he was transferred to a different reformatory, and it says, and suddenly he turned over a new leaf, and he became the model prisoner almost overnight. And that act gave him a parole in May 1954. So it tells you is that he knows, even as horrible as that did, and I bet you all the people working with him at that reformatory knew what he did.
Right.
But they saw enough in his behavior to give him a parole, and to see him like, oh, he's the ideal model of what we should go for. No need to say it. Unbeknownst that Charlie would just play. They're all singing to the tune of his flute.
Right.
Well, think about Charlie, too. He's the guy who thinks about something probably 2 steps ahead. So when he's sodomizing this person, he knows that he may just get kicked out and have to go somewhere else.
Right.
And if he's getting kicked out to go somewhere else, he's going to use somebody to do that, so he can go somewhere else and create this new version of himself in order to please them and move on from there.
Right. I mean, it's really smart. It's extremely adaptive, and that's what these individuals in this category, that's what they do. They chameleon themselves. They become whatever the people in authority, the people who are reigning authority over them, whatever they want to see. When I was doing my pre-doctoral internship at Arizona State Hospital, I saw it all the time with individuals, on the forensic campus, and then also I worked on the sexually violent predator unit there too. And you watch these people manipulate their clinicians, their behavioral staff, because they know after they pay attention for a little while what it is that you want, what it is they want to hear.
Right.
And if you take that and apply it to what ended up happening in the family, in the actual cult that Manson, created and then grew, it's the exact same thing. He and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail, but he identified individuals who he could tell very quickly and easily what they needed and wanted, and then he became that for them.
Yes, and we will talk about how that came to fruition in the next episode. So we've got kind of a good foundation. You can kind of really see just the basic understanding the psyche inside the mind of Manson. How did these things affect him? How do we make sense of what he did, of these things from Charles Manson's whole life,
right,
that we're talking about, that all of these books, all these documentaries, all of these different theories that are still circulating today, that fascinates the public, that even influenced Quentin Tarantino to make Once Upon a Time in Hollywood,
yeah,
and base off these different characters and spawn rants. These all exist in the world that God created. And so in order to make full sense of this, we have to look at it in that light.
Right.
And hopefully this is something that we can do, because as much as we have appreciation for a lot of the other people who have put a lot of really good historical work,
right,
in many cases even psychological work, but if you've even talked about before, given all your practice, if you don't look at the gospel holistically as the healing point, all the psyche in the world at best is just a Band-Aid.
That's right. It's a
on
Band-Aid.
An open wound.
Right. Not a cure. Jesus is the cure. Right. And I think it's really important too, to get all presuppositional here. We, without a Christian worldview, without a Christian paradigm, none of this matters.
Right.
It doesn't matter that Sharon Tate was 8 months pregnant with her first baby, who she loved and begged for the life of. I think she and Roman were going to name him Paul. It doesn't matter that a 25-year-old Abigail Folger was stabbed to death in front of her boyfriend, and then her boyfriend, who was trying to save her, was shot in the back. None of that matters if all we are is cosmic broccoli, right? It only matters if we're made in God's image, if we have some actual objective standard for justice, for what's right and wrong, and you get that within the Christian worldview, because God spells it out really, really clearly for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, so what we're going to do is that this is really kind of just the basic introduction, as we just said. Really kind of, you mentioned, we have to look at it holistically. So Charlie had a continued life of crime that eventually led him to prison, and eventually led to 1967, the Summer of Love. But before we do that, there was a lot of times in his life of crime that really affected his worldview and kind of really made him who he was. So we're going to kind of really delve more into that, especially the lot that happened, very significant things that happened during Charlie's life of crime, prior to him really getting kind of thrown into a lot of upheaval in the late 1960s. So thank you so much for listening to this introductory part of this true crime podcast talking about Inside the Mind of Manson. You are just so giddy right now.
I am.
It's great.
Love it.
And as always, there's a lot of uncertain times right now, but we want to be able to create content like this for you all, to be able to be salt and light, to really kind of get the gospel out into these conversations, so that the world can hear, and that you can hear and be encouraged, be edified. So we are asking you just to continue to partner with us. Please prayerfully consider supporting our ministries, so we can really kind of get the gospel out into the world during these uncertain times. So please go to thecultishtshow.com. Go to thecultishtshow.com. You can donate one time or monthly. Become part of the Cultish crew, so you can go ahead and partner with us. We can allow more content to be able to bless you all. We need your help. We cannot do this without you. So all that being said, thank you so much for listening in. We'll talk to you in the next chapter of Inside the Mind of Manson.